Well, greetings to everyone and welcome. Good evening. If you're on the East Coast, good afternoon, good morning. I'm Rachel Saunders, the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Curator of Asian Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program with Professor Matthew McKelway in association with the special exhibition, Painting Edo, Japanese Art from the Feinberg Collection. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. As many of you will know, Painting Edo is the largest exhibition we've ever mounted at the Harvard Art Museums, which is fitting because it showcases one of the largest and most significant gifts of art ever promised to this museum, the Feinberg Collection, created through the extraordinary commitment of Robert and Betsy Feinberg over a period of almost 50 years now. We also owe great debts of gratitude to our sponsors, including the Japan Foundation and the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, the generous co-sponsor of this evening's event. Now, the exhibition opened in February of 2020, and it was physically open for a month before the pandemic forced us to close the doors. And since then, we have been offering as much virtual access as possible through videos, an online exhibition, and programming like this. The exhibition is titled Painting Edo as a nod to the central role of painting in reflecting and constructing both the early modern Edo period of 1615 to 1868 and its first city, known to us today as Tokyo. The exhibition offers a revisionist history of early modern Japanese painting, but also, and more importantly, an immersive experience of seeing differently. And we couldn't have foreseen quite how different that would be, and being forced into the Zoomverse during this period has really amplified that. And that's an experience we've had very positively sustained in our collaborative programming with colleagues at the Arnold Arboretum over the past year on bird and flower painting. And if you're interested in checking that out, we have recorded all those events and they're on our website. Another positive outcome of this time is that we've been able to invite Professor McKelway to join us this evening. Now, Matthew was scheduled to be in Japan in March 2020 when we'd originally scheduled our lecture programming. And so we had to resign ourselves to the sad fact that he wouldn't be able to join us then. But now we have this new opportunity, and I couldn't be more delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening's event. Matthew McKelway is the Takeo and Itsuko Atsumi Professor of Japanese Art History and the inaugural director of the Mary Griggs Burke Center for Japanese Art at Columbia University, where he has taught since 2007. Professor McKelway specializes in the history of Japanese painting, and his research initially focused on urban representation in screen paintings of Kyoto, rakuchu rakugaizu, and the development of genre painting in early modern Japan, but has extended to Kano school painting, rimpa, and individualist painters in 18th century Kyoto, particularly Nagasawa Rosetsu. Matthew lectures and publishes widely in both English and Japanese, and in all of his many and varied contributions, he has sought to understand Japanese paintings according to the physical and cultural context of their creators, in order to discover the motivations, whether these be political, personal, literary, or philosophical, that drove them to make pictures in particular ways. Matthew has been a visiting professor at numerous prestigious institutions around the world, including the Free University of Berlin, the University of Heidelberg, and Seijo University in Japan. Professor McKelway has also curated and co-curated a number of important exhibitions. I'm not going to mention them all here, but I'd just like to point out the Silver Wind exhibition, The Arts of Sakai Hoitsu, that was at the Japan Society in New York in, I think it was 2012. And most recently, the spectacular Rosetsu, Ferocious Brush, which is at the Rietberg Museum in Zurich in 2018. Now tonight, Matthew is going to speak to us about an important folding screen format work in the Feinberg collection by Kano Sansetsu, a painter with a reputation for, shall we say, eccentricity. And I, for one, am looking forward to taking a journey of close encounter into this really magnificent and somewhat mysterious painting. Following Professor McKelway's talk, we're very fortunate to have with us Yukio Lippert, Jeffrey T. Chambers, and Andrea Okamura, Professor of History of Art and Architecture here at Harvard University. and I'm very happy to say my co-curator of Painting Edo. And Professor Lippett's going to be offering a response. Among his publications, his many publications, is his award-winning book, Painting of the Realm, The Kano House of Painters in 17th Century Japan. So as you can see, we really couldn't be in better hands this evening for discussion of this painting and its painter. And I'm really delighted that we're able to gather here with an audience of, I think it's over 400 people now, tuning in from all over the globe to do so. We're using the webinar format this evening, so your videos will remain off and your microphone is muted throughout. Our program is scheduled to run until about 8 p.m., perhaps a few minutes after Eastern time. And given the specialisms of both speakers, we're anticipating there'll be much to discuss. But we do welcome you to enter questions, reflections, or comments that you may wish to share in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address those at the end of the program, if time allows. And otherwise, we'll pass these along to our distinguished speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Professor McKelway.
Thank you, Rachel, for that extremely kind introduction. It's really a double honor to be asked and given a second chance, as Rachel indicated, I have to admit, because last March, as she mentioned, a long planned seminar trip to Kyoto, one that I had been hoping to do for about a decade, meant that I couldn't join in the symposium originally scheduled for that point. Of course, everything was canceled, and so how wonderful it is actually to reboot and to start anew just as spring is upon us and the pandemic hopefully soon in abeyance. I want to start out by thanking again Dr. Rachel Saunders for the invitation, Professor Yukio Lippett for what I predict will be bracingly incisive commentary at the end, and also Molly Ryan and Matthew Rogan of the Harvard Art Museums, as well as the Reischauer Center of Japanese Studies for all of their generous support, logistical and otherwise. The screen paintings by the 17th century painter Kano Sansetsu that are the subject of the talk tonight are one of my favorites among favorites in the collection of Bob and Betsy Feinberg. Though I missed the chance to see the inaugural exhibition when it was on display early last spring, as I was anxiously planning what would end up being the no-go trip to Kyoto with my students, I enjoyed seeing an earlier an earlier exhibition at the newly reopened Harvard Art Museum a couple of years ago. And before that, on several visits to the Feinberg's beautiful home in Maryland. It seems like a lifetime ago when we could gather in the living room downstairs to admire such visually stunning works as the screens by Soga Shohaku or the magical landscapes of Kyoto by Yamamoto Baitsu, another favorite and one of the unexpected surprises that Bob and Betsy sometimes pulled out, casually pulling out a pair of folding screens to throw me off balance and thus to educate me. Sansetsu's pair of screens is now titled A Visit to Ning's Secluded Dwelling and Wang Ziyou Visiting Andao, reflecting its combination of an image from a 4th century Chinese story from the Eastern Jin dynasty with an illustration of a famous poem of the Tang dynasty. Executed in monochrome ink with a thin wash of gold paint in the right screen only, these screens signify many things. They show how the disassemblage and recombination of Chinese themes in Japan could produce something new and layered with additional divergent meanings. They spotlight the paired folding screen's capacity as a format to throw particular themes and meanings into relief and thereby add new ones to them. They demonstrate in their style and content Sansetsu's own predilections and his debts to his Kano predecessors, particularly Kano Sanraku. Sansetsu was one of the most intellectually acute artists that his vast dominant clan would produce. I hope to show how, by drawing from altogether different kinds of Chinese sources, both literary and pictorial, he brings something new to both screens by pairing them on folding screens, an act itself that highlights the significance of format in Japanese art. We will proceed in 4 steps, starting with the surface, briefly to show how these works exemplify Sansetsu's idiosyncratic manner, then moving beneath the surface to see how he visualizes his subjects, Next, stepping backwards in time to imagine his likely source material, and then pulling away from the screens to imagine them in their possible local and historical contexts. But first, who was Kano Sansetsu? This painter, probably now familiar to most students of Japanese art from his inclusion in Tsuji Nobuo's famous book, Lineage of Eccentrics, or Kiso no Keifu, was until that book's publication perhaps best known as a late holdout of the grand Momoyama style perfected by his predecessor, Kano Eitoku, whose manner of painting emphasized big, boldly composed motifs that filled painting surfaces often sheathed with reflective gold leaf. Ernest Fenollosa, in his review of the chapter on painting in Louis Gonze's L'Art Japonais of 1885, writes that, quote, Sansetsu indeed is a splendid and original artist to whom the Japanese have seldom accorded due consideration. But though living in the 17th century, he is the last representative of the earlier Kano style, and in short, an anachronism, unquote. Following the Japanese scholar Doi Tsugiyoshi's systematic documentation of surviving works in Kyoto and surrounding areas in the 1950s and 1960s, Tsuji was the first to recognize Sansetsu's originality as an artist. He discovered in what others had regarded as anachronistic mannerism, instead an irrepressible individuality, a prescient resistance to dominant approaches to painting among his Edo-based relations. In 2013, the Kyoto National Museum held a major retrospective of Kano Sanraku and Sansetsu, amassing some 83 works, of which about 3/4 were identified as by Sansetsu, and some of them were identified as by both. But I think we get a better idea of this artist's life, his character, and approach to painting if we go back much further to sources from his own time. A long encomium written around 1660 by Hayashi Gaho, a Confucian scholar who possibly knew Sansetsu, tells us that he originally hailed from a samurai family in Kyushu, that he liked to draw and paint as a child, and that when his father died, he was apprenticed to Sanraku as a teenager through connections from an uncle who was a priest. Gaho goes on to explain that Sansetsu eventually married Sanraku's daughter and was adopted as his son-in-law, and granted the Kano name, was designated as Sanraku's successor. The most interesting part of Gaho's extended account is his emphasis on Sansetsu's scholarly proclivities. He is described as possessing several Chinese painting histories, as writing his own treatises, and also as a stickler for iconographical accuracy and precision, who enjoyed the company of Confucian scholars and the patronage of the court nobility. Recent writing on Sansetsu by the art historian Igarashi Koichi, as well as the works themselves, including the screens from the Feinberg collection, confirm Gaho's early characterization. So now we go to the surface. The Feinberg screens are instantly recognizable as representing Sansetsu's distinctive manner. The parabolic, snow-covered mountaintops and stands of pines in the left screen, the low horizon in both, the angular geometric bias of the rocks and mountains in the right screen, the exacting control of graded ink washes in both. All are hallmarks of Sansetsu's style that the painter repeatedly reassembled in his works. Comparison with an earlier work, a screen painting attributed to the 16th century painter Kano Chokichi, highlights Sansetsu's approach. His ground plane is lower, his motifs are fewer and less crowded, and he frames the composition more deliberately with a cluster of rocks on the left. Where the earlier painter attempts to handle transition into depth with a series of layered planes, guiding us step by step diagonally from left to right, Sansetsu takes great leaps through widely spaced, overlapping planes, drastically reducing the scale of motifs to achieve an impression of vast open space. This effect comes through especially well in the middle panels of the left screen, where Wang Ziyou appears on his moonlit journey, his boat aligned with a series of motifs that begins in the sky with the full moon above and extends past the towering snowy peak to the pagoda of a distant temple along a meandering river crossed by a low bridge to a curving stand of pines. He handles things differently in the right screen, which frames a waterside retreat with lofty peaks, diagonally thrusting rocks in the first panels, and a broad, infinitely spreading expanse of water to the left. Here, he stages motifs with the utter clarity of his precise gradations of ink, with a spectrum of grays, both fading and becoming narrower in range, the further into the background we go. He replaces the undulating softness of snowy mountains with crisply angled and contoured rock forms that, in their forced geometricity, create an otherworldly, surreal impression. Throughout the screens, Sansetsu displays his distinctive hand to create his world and occupy it. This realm is one of clearly modeled but crystalline forms whose limited number and generous spacing add up to something that, if not entirely lyrical, is still evocative and inviting. We next go beneath the surface and ask, what do these screens depict? When the screens were first shown in 2003 at the Shizuoka Prefectural Museum's exhibition, The World of, before the Feinbergs acquired them, they were called Moonlit Summer and Winter Landscapes. At the time, I had just finished an article on Sansetsu's screens of West Lake and had learned that Sansetsu's unusually intense academic passions would have demanded a specific subject. The left screen portrayed a subject that was familiar enough, the moonlit visit of Wang Ziyou to his friend Dai Andao, for this was a subject that Sansetsu portrayed many times and which also appeared in the works of his predecessors. But the right screen was puzzling. There was something oddly precise in its imagery. The single figure at the gate, the distinctive vertical rock at the shore, the flock of birds nesting in the foreground and the moon above. It all must mean something, if only I could figure it out. My ignorance of the Chinese classics, which continues, prevented me from cracking the code of the right screen, but eventually with the help of Sen Sooku, who was at the time a visiting scholar at Columbia in 2009, I was able to solve the riddle of the subject. Sen-san recognized the poetic source, perhaps from his study of Muramachi ink painting and training in the art of tea. He will become the Iemoto of the Musha no Koji tea lineage if he hasn't become it already, in which verses from Chinese poems figure prominently. Knowing the subjects of both screens, it becomes possible to think about them as a pair, posing the question of why, of all potential themes, it is these two that Sansetsu paired in the Feinberg screens. That both images are set at night is distinctive. I also hope to show that he paired these images for other reasons as well. The subject of the left screen, Wang Ziyou's night visit to Dai Andao, is known by a number of names, including Oshiyu Hodai and Setsuya Hodai in Japanese, which mean literally a snowy night's visit to Dai. The story relates how the calligrapher Wang Ziyou, a son of the famous calligrapher Wang Shizhi of the Eastern Jin dynasty, made an aborted visit to the villa of his friend, the painter and poet Dai Kui, or Dai Andao. The tale is included or recounted in Liu Yiqing's 5th century compendium Shushuo Xinyu, a new account of tales of the world, in a section called The Free and the Unrestrained. He goes, while Wang Ziyou was living in Shanyin, one night there was a heavy fall of snow. Waking from sleep, he opened the panels of his room and ordered wine, drank to the shining whiteness all around him. Then he got up and started to pace back and forth, humming the summons to a retired gentleman by the poet Zuo Si. All at once, he remembered Dai Andao, his friend, who was living at the time in Shan. On the spur of the moment, he set out by night in a small boat to visit him. The whole night had passed before he finally arrived. When he reached Dai's gate, he turned back without going in. Later, when someone asked him his reason, Wang replied, I originally went on the strength of an impulse, and when the impulse was spent, I turned back. Why was it necessary for me to see Dai? I think that Sansetsu's screen painting and other depictions all show Wang on his return journey, moments before the break of dawn, when the moon hangs low in the sky and slips to the horizon. And I think this is because Sansetsu's choice of a particular moment effectively aligns it with the other screen. The only figures in the scene are Wang Ziyou, his back to the viewer, and his boatman. The shuttered panels of Dai's house, the fishing rod, the idle fishing rod, the snow-laden bamboo, and distant temple cloaked in mist all bespeak the quiet stillness after a heavy snowfall, moments before dawn. With strong emphasis on laterally spread motifs and a low horizon, this is a scene of utter serenity. The theme of Wang's night visit evidently appealed to Sansetsu and his patrons, for among his known works can be counted at least 7 examples, making it perhaps Sansetsu's most common subject. Besides the Feinberg screens, these works are executed on screen paintings and other formats and include the panels in the Tenkyuin subtemple of Myoshinji, a scene in the 10 Snows screens in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and a hanging scroll in Jishoji, or Ginkakuji as it's known. Additionally, old auction catalogs indicate the existence of a screen painting formerly in the Suematsu collection paired with another screen depicting the 3 laughers of Tiger Ravine, and another pair of folding screens with the same subject but different composition, and a hanging scroll. And just last year, the Metropolitan Museum acquired a 2-panel screen painting of the night visit. In most of Sansetsu's 6 pictures or 7 pictures, Wang Ziyou leans forward in his boat, his back to the viewer. As comparison with depictions by other Kano painters, such as Sansetsu's Edo-based contemporary Kano Naonobu shows, Sansetsu's level composition and turning away of Wang Ziyou have the effect of rendering him somehow remote or even aloof, as if unwilling to engage the viewer by showing us his face. The pleasure, which Mather translates as impulse in the New Account of Tales of the World episode I mentioned, of Wang Ziyou's boat trip is his alone to savor. The pleasure is his alone to savor. Wang Ziyou's night visit was a well-known painting subject by Sansetsu's time, of course. Its source, the New Account of Tales of the World, had been known in Japan since the Heian period, and the earliest known transcriptions from the Tang Dynasty, now designated as national treasures and in the possession of the Kyoto and Tokyo National Museums. The story is also included in the primer of ancient Chinese lore, Mogyu, which also had been known since the Heian period, and which the medieval Confucian scholar Kiyohara Nobukata had rewritten as the digest Mogyu Sho in the early 16th century. It was also well known in Gozan Zen circles, mentioned with commentary, for example, in Yuzanroku, the collected writings of the 14th century priest Yuzan Shisai. The collected writings of Zen priests also include poems on the subject of Wang Ziyou's night visit. Toka Keikashu by Isho Tokugan, for example, contains 2 poems which were inscribed on pictures now lost of this episode. The deep history of literary sources of this story is paralleled by its pictorial history. Poems inscribed on lost pictures like the ones included in Isho Tokugan's anthology attest to Wang Ziyou's presence in Japan long before Sansetsu painted his screens. Xuanhe Huapu, the 1120 catalog of the Song Emperor Huizong's vast painting collection, lists pictures titled Ziyou Visiting Dai, this is on the previous slide, by such greats as Cui Bo, Guo Xi, Wang Shen, and Zhao Lingran. The earliest extant Chinese painting of the theme I've been able to locate so far is an album leaf attributed to the Southern Song Dynasty Academy painter Ma Yuan in an album in the National Palace Museum, and it actually bears his signature. Extant depictions by Ming Dynasty painters such as Zhou Wenjing and Xia Kui suggest that similar images may already have reached Japan even earlier. Perhaps the earliest known depiction of the night visit in Japan is an anonymous hanging scroll datable to about 1476 by the inscription of the Zen priest Kizai Miiku, who extols the elegance of Wang Ziyou's feelings, his friendship with Andao surpassing mere physical meeting. Panel paintings by Kano Motonobu's workshop in the monastery Myoshinji affirm the theme's position as part of the established visual repertoire of Zen Buddhism. Motonobu's panels for the Reiyuin subtemple were just a short walk away from Tenkyuin, where Sansetsu would also depict the night visit, scene a century later. The night visit appears also in Kososhu, the 1623 manual of Chinese painting subjects that Sansetsu appears to have frequently consulted. And it also appears in a single panel from a screen painting by Sansetsu's adoptive father and father-in-law, Sanraku. Published by Doi Tsugiyoshi in the journal Kokka in 1976, this image shows Wang Ziyou in the foreground gazing upward through a darkened sky in a picture that contrasts with Sansetsu's in composition and overall temperament. Current whereabouts known, the 12 images originally mounted on folding screens depict various figures from ancient Chinese lore and episodes of Zen Buddhist awakenings. In the Feinberg screen, Sansetsu thus represents what was by his lifetime a well-known and oft-depicted episode, but in ways that are strikingly different from that of his immediate predecessor. The other screen, A Visit to Lining's Secluded Dwelling, is somewhat more problematic. In contrast to the left screen, Sansetsu borders it with soaring mountains from which a waterfall spews forth in the upper right corner, reinforcing a series of vertical gestures that continue with the centrally placed rock in the garden and intersected by the forceful diagonal of the rocks that thrust forth from the lower right corner. The moon appears in the second panel, but the abundant gold wash bathes the upper half of the screen with a warm glow. A smiling monk appears in front of the closed thatched gate of the temple. A low bridge of 3 planks connects the foreground to the area where the vertical rock stands, and if we look closely, we will see a low-growing tree, different from all of the others, in which some birds have alighted for the evening. The monk, the birds, the rock, the bridge, and the moon are motifs that seem deliberately placed, unlike the familiar figure of Wang Ziyou in the left screen, a combination uncommon in Sansetsu's known corpus of work. A poem by the Tang Dynasty poet Jia Dao, title for Li Ning's hermitage, or more elegantly, A Visit to Li Ning's Secluded Dwelling, turns out to be the source. And the poem goes, "Few houses stand near this quiet abode, where a grassy path leads to an overgrown garden. As birds roost in a tree by the water, a monk knocks at the moonlit gate. Crossing a bridge leads to mountains and fields. The rock seems to move like clouds welling up. If I leave for a while, I will return once again without breaking my vow of reclusion." Again by Jia Dao of the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Sansetsu illustrates all of the principal motifs from Jia Dao's poem: the roosting birds, the monk before the gate under the moon, the bridge, the rock welling up like clouds, and what appears as a literal rendering of the poem. Although the monk under the moonlit gate of the right screen is a rarer pictorial subject than Wang Ziyou's nighttime journey in the left, it is based on a famous Tang Dynasty poem included in the San Taishi anthology of Chinese poetry that reached Japan in the 14th century and was printed in Japanese editions by Zen priests of the Gozan monastic network. Jia Dao's composition of the poem is itself the subject of an anecdote included in the 10th century anthology Jianjie Lu by He Guangyuan, I'm sorry, I do only the 4th tone in Chinese, that recounts how the poet, lost in thought while riding a donkey and trying to decide between using the word push or tui or knock, chow, in the poem, accidentally ran into the procession of the official Hanyu, who was also an accomplished poet, who advised Jia Dao to use the word knock instead of push or tui. And the character for knock can also mean to clap in Japanese. Interestingly, it is this meta episode about the poem's composition that the 17th century book illustrator Hasegawa Toun selects for his compendium of painting subjects, Ehon Hokan, published a few decades after Kano Sansetsu's death. In Toun's illustration, we see the poet Jia Dao riding his donkey and encountering the noble Hanyu's procession. Its inclusion in the book indicates to me that the episode had been absorbed into Japanese pictorial consciousness by this point, and its focus on the episode about the poem, not illustrating it, turns out to be useful for understanding the Feinberg screen. Now, searches through the sources that Sansetsu might have consulted, such as Koso Shu, the Gusher Huapu, Bajong Huapu, and others, has yielded so far no examples or illustrations of Jia Dao's poem, but Sansetsu's depictions were not without precedent. For example, an album of paintings after Tang poems, famous Tang poems by the Ming Dynasty painter Sheng Maoyue in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art includes a scene in which we find a monk, here shown knocking at the door of a temple, full moon straight above, and a flock of birds roosting in a tree before him, all matching Jia Dao's poem, 2 lines of which are quoted in the inscription up above. Closer to Sansetsu, another image by Kano Sansetsu from the same folding screens as his image of Wang Ziyou's night visit depicts the same poem, but in a manner closer to Sheng Maoyue's than Sansetsu's depiction. A monk knocks at a temple door, as in Sheng Maoyue's image, but not Sansetsu's, under a full moon, birds perched in the branch above. Sanraku's monk turns away to knock at the gate, while Sansetsu's monk faces us and gestures with his hands. Although the painting subject is the same, it appears that differences in interpreting the poetic source led Sansetsu to diverge from his adoptive father's version. Sansetsu himself produced at least one more treatment of A Visit to Li Ning's Secluded Dwelling. On the right-hand hanging scroll in a triptych that also includes depictions of the god of longevity, Jurojin or Shu Laoren, floating in billowing clouds, and a landscape in the boneless, soft style evoking rain and clouds at the left. I've seen these paintings only in photos from the auction house that sold them in California, but I feel confident that they are Sansetsu's authentic works, wherever they might be. The scroll's accompanying box lists the outer paintings simply as landscapes, but it's clear that the right-hand scroll is a portrayal of Jia Dao's poem, with a bare minimum of the requisite motifs or elements. The full moon, a smiling monk outside a gate, raising his hands in the same gesture as in the screen painting, and 5 birds roosting in a tree by the shore. The hanging scroll's smaller format may have necessitated a more abbreviated image in which other motifs, such as the garden rock and path, were discarded. It appears that in the present work, Sansetsu rearranged and modified some of these basic motifs just enough for it to be recognizable as Jia Dao's poem. Jia Dao's quandary about which character to knock or to push, Chao or Tui, to use appears to be Sansetsu's main interest in his own 2 known paintings of A Visit to Li Ning's Secluded Dwelling. It's the subject of the famous anecdote about Jia Dao, his selection of the character Chao, or to knock, around which his painting's difference from others seems to pivot. It is easy to miss the way that he describes the monks, how the monks hold their hands in front of them, until we look closer at these 2 tonsured figures. A viewer might then notice that while they appear to be clapping their hands, they are in fact holding one hand in a fist and the other one open. So what could this gesture mean? I think you probably know by now, but let's go. How can you clap your hands with one hand closed? It has taken me some time to refine my thoughts on this, but I think that the closed hand is the one that knocks if we interpret the pivotal and problematic character Chao in this way, while the other hand, open outward and upward, provides the option of pushing. Considering Sansetsu's choices even further, we might find in the monk's gentle smiles a winking recognition that when we contemplate this detail up close, we may finally understand the painting's message. The monk literally provides an early Edo period push, or knock, take your pick, against the painting's 4th wall, momentarily stepping out of his role as the subject of an illustrated poem and into a position of shared consciousness with the viewer who knows of the ancient poet's lexical dilemma. According to Chisen Song, a graduate student, first-year graduate student here at Columbia, the phrase Tui Chao is a common one in modern Chinese, in which it means to deliberate, to weigh, or to scrutinize. And in Japanese, it carries the meaning or nuance of to perfect or to polish. It could be that by showing the monks doing both, that Sansetsu emphasized the inseparability or non-duality, if you will, of both characters. we're left to wonder how attuned his viewers were to this level of finesse. So now we step outside the screen's iconographical origins and away from their surfaces to think of them again as a pair. Almost always created in sets of two, folding screens can be expected to operate according to an interrelational logic in which seemingly unconnected subjects can and should be considered to add up to something more than their component parts. The first answer to this question vis-a-vis the Feinberg screens is that both depict themes connected somehow to themes or to topics of reclusion, as do other subjects like the three laughers of Tiger Ravine, the four sages of Mount Shang, and so forth, that were intrinsic parts of the pictorial programs of Zen Buddhist monasteries by Sansetsu's time. As we have seen, this is true also of Wang Ziyou's night visit. And from what I know so far of Jiadao's poem too, the monastery Tofukuji, for example, has a gate called the Gekkamon, or moonlit gate, quoting directly from the poem in its precincts. And the poem is also cited by Gozan monks in their inscriptions on paintings. Sansetsu, I think, takes things a couple steps further. He turns Wang Ziyou away from us. He turns the lone monk away from the gate and towards us, away from Ning, secluded in his dwelling. He doesn't break his vow of reclusion while Wang Ziyou chooses it. They both do it wordlessly. Here we see Sansetsu encoding the screens with a subtle temporality, for both scenes show, I think, an anticlimactic moment. Both Wang and the monk appear right after deciding not to see their friends, leaving Andao and Ning in tranquil, blissful solitude. I'm grateful both to Melissa McCormick and Ting Shu, a postdoc here at Columbia, for helping to push me to this conclusion, if not knock me towards it. In the end, it becomes clear that it's very difficult to understand Sansetsu's screen paintings solely on their own terms. Their imagery is so specific that it reminds us that while Japanese paintings seldom come down to us with titles, they always have subjects that reveal themselves if we are just willing to look for them hard enough. A recognition of Sansetsu's purposes depends in part on awareness of other pictures, in this case, particularly those of his father-in-law or adopted father, Kano Sanraku. Sanraku may not have been the first to bring together the story of Wang Ziyou's midnight outing and the poem by Jiadao, but it's probably safe to say that this would have been the pairing that Sansetsu was aware of. I haven't pushed the point or potential of Zen to illuminate these themes very hard in this talk, but two factors encourage us to see them through this lens. First, Sanraku's original grouping of them together with scenes of monks experiencing moments of spiritual awakening, and second, the established presence of Wang Ziyou as a pictorial subject in Zen contexts, like the panels at Myoshinji. To take a step further outside these images, we might also remember that both stories evoke a certain element of humor or the ridiculous. Who would go to the trouble to board a skiff on a freezing night, go all the way downriver to a friend's house, and then turn back without saying hello? This, of course, is Wang Ziyou, whose spontaneity and freedom from convention had great appeal to practitioners of Zen Buddhism. Jiadao's poem is not as clear. Sanraku presents us with a straightforward illustration of a monk knocking at a gate, while Sansetsu, perhaps by emphasizing the ambiguity of the monk's gesture, reminds us of the poet's puzzlement over his choice of words. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for that illuminating talk. I'd like to ask Professor Lippert to join us now and begin the bracing conversation you were referring to earlier.
Great. Thank you. And good evening, everybody. We've heard a remarkable lecture about a remarkable work of art. Professor McKelway, who I have the privilege of calling Matthew, and who is really the world expert on Sansetsu, who has published a sequence of books and articles on the artist that have further explored his relationship to extremely sophisticated and esoteric subject matter, has not only discovered the elusive subject of the right screen of this work in particular, but it's also taken us into the world of the work, the poetic imagination that it presupposed, how its details are closely tied to nuances of meaning, and finally, how the work has interesting subtleties of mood and timing in relation to the stories they pictorialize. And I would say also that for a painter who bears the surname Kano, this is unexpected. And this takes us into kind of newer zones of interpretation, experience, and appreciation of works by Kano painters. Time is precious. So I'd like to ask you, Matthew, a few questions in the hopes of having you elaborate a bit more on the nature of the artist Sansetsu and this, again, this unique screen in the Feinberg collection. And to start off, I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a bit more on the characterology of Sansetsu, a fascinating artist who has been canonized as among the most, as an exemplar of individualism by Tsujinobu, who you mentioned, from the 1960s onward. We have tantalizing clues about his life. We know he was, thanks to your work, he was very close to a circle of Confucianists in Kyoto, very close to aristocratic families. He spent some time in debtor's prison, apparently. We have these fragments. We know that he began to compile the entries that would lead to the first compendium of Japanese painters' biographies, the Honchogashi, published by his son Eno in 1693. But could you give us more of a profile of his life and personality, and what you call temperament, very interesting temperament, and apparently different from his father Sandaku, and to what extent it's possible to glean something of these elements, perhaps from the screens you've just introduced us to?
Sure, thank you. I can try. I have to give some vocal footnotes also to a couple of the scholars in Japan whose work I really admired and have drawn from in my own study of Sansetsu. First of those is Hayashi Susumu of the Yamato Bunkakan, who actually I didn't want to show too many images, but I'll show it now, who curated the first exhibition devoted solely to Kano Sansetsu back in 1986. I wasn't in Japan yet, but I got the catalog later, informed about it by Okudaira Shunroku, long professor at Osaka University, and a mentor of mine who did a great deal of scholarship on Sansetsu as well, writing an important article in Koka, for example, on some screen paintings of the environs of Kyoto, which is partly what drew me to Sansetsu, because that was a subject I was interested in before. So I would say that already the Yamato Bunkakan show probably, especially in Hayashi's essay, the draw of the world of immortality, I guess is the Senkyo no Sasoi was the title of his essay, already was beginning to move away from Tsuji's interpretation of Sansetsu as an eccentric, and it took about 15 years for that to happen since the publication of Kiso no Keifu earlier, and I think that it was partly maybe the discovery or rediscovery of a work called Pangu Valley, which is a subject also of painting. We're getting a little bit deep here, but a painting by Dongchi-chan that originally had an inscription, I think on the box, by Nawa Kasho, who is one of these, part of this circle of Confucian scholars whom Sansetsu knew, that describes the work and sort of gives a title to what's otherwise just kind of generic ink landscape. Not generic, I mean, it's never generic with Sansetsu, but a landscape with dramatic waves and mountains and so forth. So I was already a little bit attuned to other ways of thinking about Sansetsu, just from the beginning because of this earlier work that had been done. But the Kiso no Keifu, establishes the paradigm, which is sort of hard to sort of push back against or to sort of move against because it's so convincing. I mean, Tsuji really does come up with a really compelling argument for a way to look at painting in early modern Japan that doesn't depend on some of the more traditional kind of stylistic analyses, or even the idea of different painting schools that we have come to accept in Japanese art. So about Sansetsu's life, what I've been, as I've been reviewing that recently in preparation for today's talk, what struck me was that there's really not that long a period of time during which he's completely independent of Sanraku. He dies in 1651. He's active in the 1640s. Sanraku dies in 1635, is that right? So we're looking at a period of about 15, 16 years, at the end of which, as you mentioned, he's thrown in jail, and which is also something that Tsuji goes into in his essay, now luckily translated in English. And it was in the Kyoto National Museum, sort of a kind of almost a nail biter or kind of cliffhanger situation when that show was being put together, that I think that the document that seems to indicate that Sansetsu was freed from prison was discovered in the I guess some reference to it in the notebooks of Doitsugi Yoshi had been known. So he apparently he takes over the Kano name in Kyoto, receives the name of Kano from Sanraku, takes the San, the first character of his name, from Sanraku, and adds the Yuki or Setsu. I think he takes that probably from Sesshu. So you have this name that literally means snowy mountains, which he paints a lot. Marries Sansetsu, Sanraku's daughter. They have children, among whom is Kano Eno, of course, that's his natural son. But it seems that there was another son, and this other son, I'm not sure if he was a painter or not, but he was evidently something of a ne'er-do-well, and apparently it's his debts that caused Sansetsu to be thrown into prison for a time, close to the end of his life, really ironically. And it seems that Sansetsu is kind of taking the hit for this indebted younger brother-in-law, I guess.
It's always the wayward brother.
Yes, it is. Usually the younger one, of which I am. But we don't really know much more about that, except for that this document that was found in preparation for the Kyoto show in 2013, that it was Nijo Yukiie. It was this long time noble and long-lived, he lived a very long life. He outlived, I think, all of his children, or most of them, who was in fact a patron of Sanraku too. He commissioned paintings, including these marvelous paintings of the Battle of the Carts episode from the Aoi chapter of the Tale of Genji for his palace early in the 17th century. And that patronage was passed on, apparently, to Sansetsu. I think probably through collaborative works that he and Sanraku were doing together when Sanraku was still alive. And as Igarashi has shown in his book, there's a sort of multi-generational connection that the Nijo family has to the Kyogano, and they're not their exclusive sole supporters or patrons, but they seem to have used their influence to help them out and get them out of sticky situations. Well, that's a bit, yeah.
Matthew, in kind of reading your work and your research on Sansetsu, I get the impression that the surname Kano is a little bit deceptive, that Sansetsu is this interesting experiment of someone who has inherited the model, the copybooks, the kind of traditional, fumpong of the Kano studio through his father Sanraku. Yeah. But he has systematically reinterpreted that corpus in the light of the new Sinophilia of the 17th century, and further and taken it into such a different direction that eventually people like Tsuji will call him eccentric, but he has a very different temperament. And so I wanted to ask you, what does it do for you when you see the screen you've just talked about, and you turn, for example, Wang Ziyou around so that his back is to us instead of facing us, which is such you might say a literal presentation of the subject matter in Sanraku, somehow turning the back to us does something else, completely transforms the subject. And by the same token, you've also shown that the monk is visiting Li Ning, turns around and faces us. And that too, with the smile, completely transforms what is otherwise, although rare, still a kind of a subject matter that has been passed down within the Kano school. Could you talk a little bit more about how you see the difference in temperament or transformation of interpretation there?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try. It's a great point that you've made about the name. I mean, his original name was probably Chiga, or his mother apparently was from the Matsura family, in around Hizen province in Kyushu. So I'm not going to go so far as to say that he maintains a kind of detachment from the overall clan. He does participate, of course, in things like the Taima Deraengi, which includes members of the Edo-based Kano as well, early in his career. But he's sort of famously excluded from certain projects like the Imperial Palace of the late Kanye period. Looking at his work and looking at the screens from the Feinberg collection in particular, one of the things that I sort of realize or sort of consider about him that is so striking is that you could take, for example, any generation or two generations of Kano painters. You could take Eitoku and Mitsunobu, you could take, let's say, Takanobu and Tanyu, or Tanyu and his brothers, or Tanyu and his son, Morimasa, or Tanshin, maybe. And you'd see, or Sansetsu and Eino, for example, and you'd see quite a bit of similarity in style from one to the other. But from Sanraku to Sansetsu, you don't really see that. He uses similar and often identical subject matter, but he doesn't really paint in the way that Sanraku did. I mean, they're really distinctive from each other. And I hesitate to go sort of too far into sort of in the direction that Tsuji did originally for Jakuchu, based on the long Ito Jakuchu, on whom you've done amazing work. I've written quite a bit as well. This idea, that notion that Jakuchu that was a recluse, that he did not enjoy the company of other people. In a way, the encomium by Hayashi Gaho that I cited earlier suggests similar things about Sansetsu, that he preferred the elegant to the mundane, that he preferred to sort of keep away from lots of people, that he preferred to spend time with his books and study. But I don't think that the works really reveal that. I think that they show instead that he was part of a community, as we could say with Jakuchu later on as well. I think that's probably true for virtually any artist, except maybe Jackson Pollock late in his life. The biographies they're tantalizingly difficult to sort of tease out because we just don't really know that much. But if we take the works and try to line them up with their patrons and their context, then maybe that can reveal more. I think he was quite proud. I think the fact that Gaho says that makes this point about his being a stickler for accuracy, and that Eino says that too in Honsho Gashi, as you've pointed out in your chapter on that book, in your book on the Kano school. I think that means that if this might have been a myth, but this was a myth that they really thought was true or wanted to promote.
Well, I think in that regard, what you say about him breaking the fourth wall is really reflective of Sansetsu's, uniqueness among not just the Kano but painters of his period. He's not just staging subject matter wonderfully, but he's kind of interpreting it as in your reading. So, when Wang Ziyou has his back to us, what that seems to do is it exteriorizes his mind onto this vast snowy landscape, right? So it's a mind, it turns it into a mindscape, and we're him enjoying the landscape somehow. And it's really a painting as an interpretation in a way that you just don't find in especially in this early period in Edo, right? Is utterly unique. So
yeah, I think that, I mean, I didn't really quite address that point well enough in my previous response, but I think that what we might almost be moving towards is a kind of something like the literati ideal that will become much more prevalent later in the 17th century, and especially in the 18th. And it is interesting that, you know, you look at works like the Jubenjugi by Taiga and Buson. There are those pictures, I can think of one or two, in which you have a figure looking out at a landscape, out a window, and we're invited to participate in that, or to place ourselves in the picture, as maybe with Wang Ziyou too. And, you know, maybe we could even say that Sansetsu was imagining himself perhaps as Wang Ziyou. The scale is interesting. I mean, I think that it's hard to imagine that he had much access or opportunity to look at, let's say, late Song Yuan painting, particularly works by literati painters. But the sensibility seems to be there. The sort of interest in the themes seems to be there. And this, I wouldn't quite call it lyrical, but this reduction of motifs of the figure and the grandeur of the landscape. I certainly feel that with the Westlake screens in the Bernstein collection, and also with the 10 Snows, those magnificent screens in the MFA in Boston.
I was going to ask you about this because you showed this nice compendium of previous works by Chinese masters, and you get the feeling looking at those that Sansetsu has maintained for the figures, the protagonists of each screen, the intimacy of scale you associate with albums or hanging scrolls. You know, normally when you transpose those themes onto a folding screen, you blow up the figures, but he's decided to keep them as small as you would have in an intimate viewing format, and he just made the landscape larger. So you can't stand, you have to both, you can stand back and look at the screens, but you also have to go up very close. And some of us have to get up really close to the screens to figure out these wonderful details you point out, you know, the hand and yeah, the back turned to the viewer. It's remarkable. It's almost two different, the screens are presupposing two different modes and distances of viewing at once.
Yeah. It's also possible. I mean, I hadn't really thought so much about the seasons in them until I think I was reading the Rachel and Matthew kindly sent me a PDF of the wonderful entry on the screens by Melissa. And I think that, yeah, summer and winter probably are right. And, you know, it's possible that for those who are not as interested in the poetic and the literary themes as we might be, they could have been a winter screen and a summer screen. You know, you have the seasonality, this interest in, I mean, that could be enough. You know, I mean, I can easily imagine a priest at a sub-temple of Myoshinji saying, "Kore wa natsu no sansui, kore wa fuyu no sansui," and
right,
just leaving it at that. You know,
and if those different levels are also of audience are built into the screen structure, even more remarkable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Matthew, can we talk a little bit about Zen?
You can talk about Zen.
Actually, I see in the question and answer, there are a few questions about this as well, but you made this really interesting point about how Sandaku is presenting his version of the subject within the context of Zen, Zen subjects like koan. And of course, Zen is always in the milieu in Japan. So Sansetsu may be more literati-esque than his fellows, but he differs from Chinese literati colleagues, contemporaries, in that he's working, we have to imagine, in a Zen milieu, in a milieu that resonates with, surrounded by, and possibly directly in a Zen context. Do you feel that is informing the subject in the presentation here in any way? Or you mentioned non-duality, for example, and the wonderful, I mean, this is a Zen mudra, if you will, yeah. In some senses, but
yeah, I mean, that's the clumsy title I chose. It should have been the sound of one hand not knocking, right? But I think so. I think that there's I mean, you had mentioned to me earlier in our conversation before all this, the element of sound and silence. as signifiers within Zen and moments of awakening. So I think that certainly is there. I think that the context of these, I sort of what I have difficulty with is saying, okay, well, they have a Zen association because of the association that already exists between these pictures and Zen. but I'm not really quite certain how, other than through the the advent of what we might call Gozan Bungaku, Gozan literature, that these themes really have that are that closely tied to that context before medieval period in Japan. By Sansetsu's time, it's all there, I think. But that would, to me, be, the people I would expect to understand the screens most precisely would be a 17th century Zen priest, someone who who was interested in or was aware of what he had done at Tenkyuin, for example, where he has not the monk at the door, but the Wang Ziyou visit, as well as the three laughers of Tiger Ravine, right in the Tokugawa. So he's conflating them, sort of putting them together in that context. But what do you think?
Well, I think based on your interpretation, there's this wonderful way in which normally sound is so important to Zen koan. The sound is an acoustic catalyst to spiritual awakening in koan. There's usually a sudden, the pebble kicking up against a bamboo, a priest throwing his key against a wooden table, and the clang suddenly parts worlds for him, and he's thrown into a new state of consciousness. But what's interesting in your reading of the right screen, there's the knock would be the obvious sonic catalyst, but this goes one step further, and it's actually the silence, the expectation of a knock, but he turns around, and then that is even more remarkably tied to the timing that you talk about. So it's both screens are at just the moment of turning around, and leading us up to the knock and then taking it away from us. So it's the doorbell ditch that never happened, so to speak. And that is a really sophisticated way of incorporating sound and silence into the thematics, you might say, the basic thematics of the work. And that, for me, I don't know, that I think you're absolutely right. That bespeaks a milieu where Chinese poetry and the Chinese classics are being appreciated by a mix of Zen monks, aristocrats, and Confucianists in ways that are resonating with these ideas of non-duality and so forth. So word, you use the word wordlessness would be another wonderful way of tying these together. Right? If we put keywords, if we had to think up 7 or 8 keywords, as we all do these days for everything, to the screen for its searchability, wordlessness should certainly be one of them, along with all of these other themes that you've brought up. So I think this actually pushes us into a new understanding of Sansetsu as more open to and informed by the Zen discourse of the 17th century than he had previously been imagined to be by Hayashi and Igarashi and others.
I guess I would also just add one. I know there are probably questions that we have to get to, but I would just add that the context of Kyoto in the 17th century as opposed to Edo, I was tinkering with a last bit on that part, but I thought it would maybe come out in the discussion. But there are restrictions being put on temples and the nobility and the court earlier in the 17th century by the Edo Bakufu, and their their financial, their regulations on how on how ordinations can occur, and so forth, and their financing, of course, is dependent on the largesse of military warlords who are based partly in Edo. So I think that it's worth maybe wondering about that aspect as well, that this is a painting that seems to speak maybe more to those who are left in Kyoto or in Kyoto who have a kind of common understanding that may be a little out of date by this point, frankly. I mean, Zen is sort of moribund around the time that Obaku comes in. That's why Obaku is so successful, I think, because the Rinzai originally had not. I mean, they're in a weakened position until Hakuin shows up. So I think they're, but at the same time, there new subtemples like Tenkyuin, Tenshoin are being built. Again, though, with warrior patronage. So I guess we can't completely keep them out of the picture. But I think that the interests that seem to be served are more the interests of insiders in Kyoto than from elsewhere, perhaps.
Yes, that's a great point. If, I think the founder of the Obaku sect, Yenyuan Longqi, comes to Japan in 1657, so after Sansetsu's death, but it were Sansetsu alive, he would surely have been fascinated by this monk, right? He would surely have been trying to form a relationship with him and understand what kind of authentic Chinese relationship to Chinese culture and painting he would have brought.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is we have our our moderator has appeared, so I think that's our sign. But again, because the theme of the evening is thoughts left incomplete, I think maybe we can hand things over here to Rachel. Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thank you, Kyo.
Thank you both very much, and you stole my line, Kyo. I was about to comment on how my appearance was going to interrupt your thoughts here. Thank you so much, both of you, Matthew, for a wonderful, deep and rich lecture about this wonderful painting, this pair of paintings in the Feinberg collection that I have long been fascinated by, but found, as I said, mysterious. And thank you, Kyo, too, for drawing out yet more from our expert on Sansetsu here. I really feel as though we got to see the surface, as you said, Matthew, and then you led us behind the curtain to see the process of how you might go about identifying paintings that, as you say, so rarely come down to us with titles, and exactly what it takes to find out what the subject is and how to read that subject. I also the way that you both highlighted some really productive tensions, both in the painting and in our ideas, our conceptualization of Kano Sansetsu, for example. We've got the sort of macro scale of the screens, and then this micro detail that we've been looking at. And you both know that I'm a fan of micro details, so perhaps we can talk about the relationship between screens and emaki a little bit later. I think there may be something there, but also just the idea of Kano, the academy versus the individualistic, and later the eccentric, and then within the paintings too, this balance of facing in and facing out, night and day. And I would add to that the incredible life that we find, especially in the right screen, in the rocks, in the landscape, that are very, very animated. But then there's this incredible acute attention to detail and control in the brushstrokes and the textures. There's a lot more we could say, I'm sure, but thank you so much for bringing out those tensions there, and for sharing with us all of your wisdom this evening. We're really delighted to have this opportunity. None of us would have liked it to come about this way, but we are very grateful that we could hear from you this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great pleasure to have you. We're just going to wrap up now our programming for this evening, but thank you so much to everybody out there who's joined us. And I'd like to say also, we've dropped a few links into the chat for ways that you can access the Painting Edo exhibition at the moment. Many of these are online. We also have two publications that you can see the Feinberg collection in. And I'd also like to put in a little plug for our next event, which is on May 25th. When we will be having a conversation between Yurika Wakamatsu, Victoria Weston, and Melissa McCormack about the remarkable, truly remarkable woman painter Okuhara Seiko. And we'll be looking at the vibrant decay in her painting, or in the painting. It's a really monumental painting that you see here, Lotus in Autumn. So that's on May 25th. Keep an eye out on our website for the sign up for that. And then I will just close the evening here by thanking you again, Matthew, and Also you, Kyo, and to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. I wish you a very pleasant night. Thank you.